Sage Wanderer coming at you from my van down by the river. So, I'm frustrated. I'm going to try to not let it show. But just so that you know that this video that you're about to watch, if by some miracle I make it all the way through this time, will be about the 100th take. That I've never encountered a video where I have had so much trouble making a video. Usually I turn this thing on, I spit them right out. You can see I don't do a ton of editing. I don't do any editing. It's one take, it's over. Straight through, just like a sermon. But this video, the attempts to make this video have been cursed. So welcome to take 100, and I'll try to hide my frustration so I can be my usual good storyteller self. Welcome to take 100 of how my best friend turned out to be a narc. Okay, so this is the story of a guy named Brian. Fake name Brian. Brian's not his real name. And Brian was a bass player. Why do I put bass player in quotations? Because this guy couldn't play his way out of a paper bag. But somehow he kept ending up in bands with me. Now the first time I didn't have a choice in whether he was going to be in the band with me or not. It just happened. I just happened to be in a band with this guy. I don't know how he got the gig. He couldn't play his way out of a paper bag. I mean, it's just really one of the worst bass players I've ever shared the stage with. And Brian, you fake jerk, if you're hearing this, I'll say it right to your face, because when we were friends, I'd tell you the same thing. And I tried to teach this guy to play. But bottom line is, if you don't have the talent, you're not going to be able to play beyond a certain level. Like, I could teach anybody to make music, make noise, but to be able to create, to be able to interact on stage, to be able to do what professional musicians do requires a lot of talent and a lot of training. So there was no training this guy out of his lack of talent. And so he actually got fired out of the first band we were in for making a horrific, horrible, awful mistake during a really critical show, a record release party. Side note on that particular album, although I didn't play on the record because it was already recorded by the time I joined the band for live touring, but I did get to sit in the producer's chair and do something very cool. I got to cut together into a customized solo the works of George Strait's fiddler. So the way it works is they hired George Strait's fiddle player to play on this record, and they flew the parts in from Nashville. So they just sent him the file. He cut 5 versions of a solo of a particular song in Nashville and emailed them back, and then we pulled them up in the studio in Dallas, Fort Worth actually, and we were able to take the 5 versions, and they had me sit down and customize phrase by phrase and pick out pieces of all 5 versions to create a customized solo. And so I got to basically play the fiddle through this guy in a lot of ways by taking the phrases and the notes and recreating them into even a better solo than any of the 5 that he had imagined. But at any rate, the record release party for this record included some big people in the music business. I mean, the producer of the record was Johnny Cash's bass player for many years. So it was a who's it of music business people at this record release party when my friend Brian dropped the ball. So he got fired out of that band, and I defended him and tried to get the guy to give him a break, give him another chance. You know, it fell under the category of stuff happens. You know, it could have happened to anybody. And but by defending him, I also got myself fired. And it was the first time I'd ever been fired out of a band in my entire life. That typically you get fired because your BS outweighs your talent. And my BS never outweighed my talent because I have a lot of talent and I'm pretty good at not carrying a lot of BS in a band. So, but this time my good nature got in the way and I got canned right along with him. And I ended up in another band with him because he found me a replacement gig because he said he felt bad. Later on, I would be fired out of that band too. 2 in a row. What was happening? Was I losing it? No, my talent was better than ever. I've just gotten better over time. couldn't figure out, you know, I realized later that Brian had set me up. But I kept being friends with this guy because Brian had a lot of positive things about him. Brian was a funny dude. Brian could string these expletives together in these descriptive ways about a person. Kind of like he would look you up and down, and then he would make all these statements about you that were funny and brutal and string them along with expletives in a way with a machine gun timing that would just put everyone on the floor. He was so funny. And I will say this, Brian always had the most amazing weed. What was Brian's story? Well, another reason we bonded is because Brian was a former Marine. Marine that had actually been trained down in Pendleton. And he'd been a military policeman in the Marine Corps. And the whole reason he was trying to play music is that he'd learned to play bass in the joint because he had been busted, he said, set up by coworkers on a security job for stealing computers, and he did a 3 or 4 year stint in the joint, and that he couldn't get a job because he was a felon and an ex-convict. And so he had to try to play music, which he learned to play the bass in the prison band. That seemed like a pretty good story. So also that made me want to help him, and I kept kind of, always trying to teach him. And but he also served another purpose for me. The guy was always out and about in the music business. Like if he wasn't playing, he was up in somebody's gig. He was somewhere, someplace talking to some musician all the time. He was out almost every night, which I was not willing to do since I had kids at home and was a single dad at the time. So with full-time custody of my kids, so I had to be home as much as possible. If I wasn't there, someone else had to be there. So at any rate, he helped me keep my thumb on the pulse of the music business because he brought me great information. He was like my little birdie who would go out and find out who was going to quit what band was going to break up, who was going into rehab, who ought to be in rehab, who was getting divorced, what was happening, who was going on tour, who was picking up a bigger gig. And I had all this really reliable information flowing from him, so I had a lot of reasons to be friends with this guy. But I decided after the second time I was in a band with him not to ever play in a band with this guy again. And I went on following my career till I landed what I consider still one of my dream gigs. This was playing in a nightclub in the house band, and the bar was the size of a super Walmart. The parking lot was so huge, you better bring hiking boots if you come late, because it was hundreds of acres of parking. This nightclub is enormous. I believe it's still there. And to land the house gig, in this place and be part of the house band, and it was a coveted job. And one of the last things I needed to really become a Texas legend in the music business, that there were certain things that you had to acquire. You had to have music awards, check. You had to have television appearances, check. You had to go on tour, check. You had to travel, and you had to be on the radio. You had to have charted, check. But you also had to have had a long or semi-long run in a house band at a major big honky-tonk in Texas, like the one I was working at, that would hold 3,000 to 5,000 people, up to 7,000, I think. I think they're fire-coded at 10, but it was nothing to have 3,000 to 7,000 people every Saturday night, every Friday and Saturday night in that nightclub. And so I landed that gig, and it was a great job. And the thing about a house gig is that the persons in the band don't get to choose who they play with. That typically it's the bar manager who hires musicians just like he hires waitresses. And they're not necessarily as good at picking musicians as they are at picking waitresses. And so oftentimes you are dealing with varying levels of experience, professionalism, and talent, unfortunately. And the musicians turn over a lot in those places because it is a bit demanding. It's very different from being in a band. You're more like the employee of the bar, and you kind of have to conduct yourself like an employee. And there's some benefits like employees get. So it's a little different than being in a freelance bar band or traveling group or recording artist. So at any rate, I'd been working there for a while, and I'd been getting my information and being kept abreast about what was going on in the music business through my friend Brian. And Brian always had the best weed, so we'd get together and smoke up. But there was a lot of weird things about Brian to me that just never made sense. For one thing, he claimed that most of his support money came from being a disabled veteran. However, he did not seem disabled to me at all. He claimed his disability was some kind of stomach injury, which there was no scar. I did go on the road with this guy, so I saw him with his shirt off. And there was no scars on him at all. And he was the most fit 37, 38-year-old guy I had ever seen in my life. Like, you could bounce quarters off this guy's abs. Like, he was UFC fit all the time I knew him. He didn't seem disabled at all. He claimed to have massive digestive problems. However, I saw that guy drop 2 chili cheese coney dogs with onions and never never stop a minute, never miss a beat. We went on the road. This guy ate whatever he wanted, drank whatever he wanted, and I never once heard him complain. I never saw him have any kind of symptoms. He never ran off to the bathroom. As a guy with stomach issues, and I have to watch what I eat, he did not seem to me to be the least bit sick at all. So his story didn't seem to play out. Plus, I could never figure out where he got all this weed during the war on drugs when no one could get any kind of weed that was decent at all. I mean, one time, for a few months, I smoked weed that had been smuggled in the body of a dead cow, and it tasted like rotten meat, but we smoked it anyway. Kids. But, yeah, where did this guy come up with all of this, good smoke? And he could get it for anyone, anytime. But anyway, back to where I was at this time. I was playing in this house band, and I had a great bass player, one of the best bass players in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I'll use his real name and give him a little push, but, Curtis Randall, what a great bass player. This guy, he's older now, but wow, solid, can sing. It was a pleasure being in a band with Curtis Randall when one night I showed up for work, and Curtis was not there. But guess who was? You guessed it, Brian. Now, I'd been talking to Brian. Brian didn't even tell me that he had been trying to join the band or had been involved in even soliciting the job for the band. And so he concealed that from me, and he told me he just wanted it to be a surprise. But he'd managed to wriggle his way into the best gig in Dallas-Fort Worth, potentially, for a musician. And he still couldn't play his way out of a paper bag. Now, I had no say in that. I went to the boss and went, why did you hire this guy? I can tell you, he's not good enough. Why didn't you ask me? I know him. He's my best friend. I know how much he sucks. I would have been honest and told you the truth. Why didn't you talk to me about it? And they were like, oh, his resume was good. He sounded like he knew what he was doing, and we needed somebody quick because, we fired Curtis, and how that happens, none of your business. And now he's in. Well, I struggled. I enjoyed my time in the band with Brian, and I struggled to work with him in his poor bass playing. And once again, I went back to trying to teach him and make him better as best I could. When I was in that band also was one of the best fiddlers and guitar players in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. This cat, bad to the bone, buddy. He's still out there. I mean, Orange Blossom Special on a wireless fiddle with a guy who's a real showman. One time I saw him fiddle out into the parking lot and fiddle his solo through the window with the whole crowd glued to the window watching this guy out in the parking lot with in-ear monitors, wireless, and wireless fiddle, fiddling away the Orange Blossom Special from the window seal. What a guy. But I come in one day and he's gone. He's been fired. And now there's this other guy who, honestly, this guy was a horrible musician, this fiddler they hired. Nothing worse than a pitchy fiddle. Nothing worse than a guy that can't play his instrument. And especially a fiddle, because it doesn't have frets. And if you're out a little bit, you're out a lot. I mean, you got to be spot on. And it's such a tiny fretboard. And this guy, he just did not have it at all. His guitar was out of tune because he tuned it by ear. And his singing was out of tune because the guy could not hold pitch. And you just didn't need to be a fiddle player and a singer if you can't hold pitch. And, once again, it was a big mystery as how this guy got in the band. But I will say this guy smelled like a cop. He didn't seem like a musician to me. He couldn't really give me any kind of resume. He didn't know anybody in the business. No one would vouch for him except for Brian. Brian got him in the band. Brian advocated him. Brian came up with this guy. And he did not belong there, neither did Brian. And my situation was getting less and less palatable every day. And I was at my wit's end with this new guy, with this new big giant, like the mustache. He looked just like the guy from Parks and Recreation with the big mustache. He was also in the Millers movie. I forget the guy's name. Not a big fan of that show, but anyway, it's who he looked like with the big mustache, and he just smelled like a cop. He did not seem like a musician at all. Everything about him seemed like a cop. His clothes, his shoes, everything was cop-like. His car looked like a cop car. I mean, he stunk like a cop to me. And so I decided to confront Brian out back while we were smoking down before the show. And I'm like, look, man, why'd you put this guy in my band? He's clearly not a musician. What were you thinking? And then he said some things, and he hem-hawed around, and I don't know what happened. Maybe God revealed it to me, but honestly, I don't know. It just seemed like suddenly I knew that my friend Brian was not who he pretended to be. Now, something that you need to know about this story and this nightclub that we were playing at is that after 3 years of playing there, I was fairly certain that there was some nefarious activity going on of a non-legal type associated with this nightclub. For one thing, everyone in the bar that worked at the bar, none of them spoke English. They all spoke Spanish. They were all Mexican nationals. The manager of the bar I never met the owner. The owner he always referred to as the family. He would say things like, I don't know, let me run that by the family. Well, the family doesn't like it so this is why we do it this way, because this is the way the family wants it. And having worked there for a while, I won't go into detail, but there were a lot of semi-trucks coming and going out of that parking lot during the week. There was there was more activity in that bar during the week than any bar I'd ever been associated with. Usually they shut down pretty good, those big honky-tonks during the week, especially during the day. But there was somebody there even in the early morning hours, which was totally uncharacteristic. So I had my suspicions about this club. And there was one night, I will say, when the manager went on the sound system and said, ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to welcome the DEA. Welcome to our party, boys. That was way weird. So I kind of always wondered whether the bar was a front for the Mexican drug cartel. And for some reason, it all just dawned on me during this conversation with Brian, and I was like, Brian, buddy, I'm starting to think maybe you're an undercover cop. I'm starting to think you're a Fed. It doesn't make sense. Your career in the music business doesn't make sense. How you got this job doesn't make sense. This fiddler doesn't make sense. And he's blowing your cover because I think he's a freaking Fed or a cop or something. Are you a Fed? Are you following me? Are you my handler? Really, tell me the truth, man. We're buddies. We've been friends for years now. You tell me. You're not who you say you are. You're law enforcement, aren't you? And I just put it to him straight up like that. I don't know. Sometimes I'm weird. I'll just call people out. I'm unafraid. And he says to me, wow, I wondered how long it was going to take you to figure it out. He said, no, I'm not a Fed. Because I start freaking out. I'm like, dude, am I going to prison? Are you trying to set me up? I mean, all I do is just smoke weed. That's the only law I break. It's the only law I break. You know, I have no record. Why are you watching me? Why don't you guys leave me alone? I'm not a terrorist. I'm just a piano player. I just want to have a good time and chase girls. What's the big deal? Why are you following me? And he's like, look, calm down. It's not about you. They don't care about you. We don't care about you. And now they really know about you because, I know you and I know what a good guy you are. You have nothing to worry about. And I'm not a Fed. He says, I'm not saying I'm law enforcement, but if I was, I wouldn't be a Fed. I would be a confidential informant working for the state police. And I wouldn't be concerned about you. If I were, I'm not saying I am, but if I were a confidential informant for the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas State Police, then I would be very concerned about the potential connection between white supremacist organizations in East Texas and the Mexican drug cartel, and how they might be trading guns and drugs back and forth, and how that could be an issue and a problem for the state of Texas. I was set up and fired the next weekend. For the third and only 3 times in my life, all 3 times in the band with my friend Brian, and I was fired again. Honestly, because I threw down with the fiddler. He was trying to take control of my gig. He was trying to take control of my rehearsal, and I chest bumped him and pulled the cable out of his guitar and told him that rehearsal was over, be back in an hour for the show. When I got back from that lunch, there were 4 cop cars in the parking lot waiting for me. And I couldn't believe that they didn't just fire me, that they had the police there to fire me and escort me out of the building with my gear and my property. And I come to find out they called the police because, see, I was part of the security in that bar too. I was like backup security. And I had talked with, sparred with, messed around with the head of security there, and we'd done some martial art things together, and he was quite afraid of me, and he did not want any of his guys having to go up against me. Someone would get hurt, and he thought it would be better if the cops came. So I was fired and escorted away from my favorite gig ever because of Brian, the undercover narc. Who'd have thunk it? My weird and weirder life. Till next time. God save the Republic.